When you hear the word fairy, what's the first image that comes to your mind? For most people, fairies are tiny people with wings who live in the forest, a magical but natural part of the world that eludes even the most dedicated explorers. We're all familiar with Tinkerbell, Navi, and stories about fairy godmother! But how did we get fairy-type Pokémon that look like this? And more importantly, why are they weak to steel of all types? Fairy is the newest Pokémon type to have been discovered, if we don't count Stellar. But Stellar only appears in Paldea, and only as a result of terrestrialization, which makes it really difficult to study. So, until we get some actual Stellar-type Pokémon and actual Stellar-type moves, we're going to count Fairy as the newest true Pokémon type. The problem is that aside from a handful of Pokemon that have a passing resemblance to traditional fairies, for most of them the connection is a little bit unclear. And a lot of trainers have asked, why are fairies weak to steel? Fortunately, we here at the University of Alola may have come up with a solution. The earliest fairy Pokemon predate the fairy type. Clefairy, Clefable, Jigglypuff, and Wigglytuff were all considered normal types prior to the discovery of the fairy type in Kalos, and Mr. Mime was originally classified as a pure psychic type. Now, let's clarify a couple of things really quickly. Despite the fairy type being discovered in 2013, there were 4 Pokemon classified in the Pokédex as fairy Pokemon: Clefairy and Clefable, and Snubbull and Granbull. These Pokédex classifications don't usually mean much, and there are countless examples of them creating confusion, like the one classifying Arcanine as the legendary Pokemon, despite not meeting any of the criteria to be considered legendary. Another thing to realize is that the fairy egg group was originally discovered in Johto in 1999, but is not directly related to the fairy type. While many fairy-type Pokemon like Alcremie and Togetic are in the fairy egg group, a few are absent. There are also several non-fairy Pokemon that are included in the fairy egg group, since egg groups are largely based on body shape. So it kind of makes sense that Clefairy and Pikachu are in the fairy egg group, but Mr. Mime isn't. So why do some Pokemon, like Marill, have the fairy type, while others, like Pikachu, don't? Or more importantly, what qualifies as a fairy? The term fairy is a catch-all that was retroactively applied to all kinds of stories and myths about anthropomorphic spirits throughout Europe, but which originated from the Old French word fairy, where fée was a term for a woman knowledgeable in magic, herbology, and medicine, what we might now call a witch. Since these spirits are featured in stories from around Europe, fairies, also known as fae and the fair folk, can come in almost any shape or size, ranging from tall, beautiful humans with butterfly wings to short, ugly goblins. Some sources hint that they were angels who were kicked out of heaven, but had not been banished to hell, while others suggest that they were the inhabitants of Earth before humans, an interpretation applied to elves and other humanoid fae by Tolkien and later authors. This broad range of what counts as a fairy means that we can classify virtually all humanoid mythological creatures as fae, including tiny winged pixies, kobolds, goblins, and elves. The definition could also broadly include both angels and demons, especially as Christianity spread throughout Europe and incorporated local religions and mythologies, classifying some as the more hostile goblins as minor demons like imps. Fairies today are usually depicted as benevolent, but older tales made them out to be mischievous pranksters, and sometimes downright hostile. They would cause disease, frighten animals, and even replace infants with changelings to be raised by human parents. So Terry Pratchett pointed out the way we've accepted fairies as being generally good, and how misleading the descriptions of them can be. In the Discworld novel Lords and Ladies, he wrote, "Elves are wonderful. They provoke wonder. Elves are marvelous. They cause marvels. Elves are fantastic. They create fantasies. Elves are glamorous. They project glamour. Elves are enchanting. They weave enchantment. Elves are terrific. They beget terror. The thing about words is that meanings can twist just like a snake. And if you want to find snakes, look for them behind words that have changed their meaning. No one ever said elves are nice. This interpretation suggests that our modern acceptance of elves and other fae as beautiful, benevolent beings is actually the result of a long-term prank, a marketing ploy by the fae collectively to lower our guard and make us more trusting. In other words, more gullible. In some areas, it became a tradition to befriend fairies, even if they didn't present themselves. In Scotland, people recognized brownies as a type of fairy that would come out at night to clean the house and work the farm. And families would leave small offerings of food or cream by the hearth to feed the brownies, but never clothes. Presenting a brownie with something as simple as a sock could be taken as an insult, and the housework would never be done again. In fact, these friendly house spirits are the inspiration for the house elves in the Harry Potter series. Fans may recall that Hermione Granger, attempting to free the house elves, started hiding clothes where they'd pick them up while cleaning, which resulted in them avoiding the Gryffindor common room, exactly as brownies were believed to behave. This wide range of fairies in mythology helps to explain the wide range of Pokemon with the fairy type. Small Pokemon associated with flowers, like Flabebe and Comfey, come from the tiny humanoid pixies. Impidimp and its family come from the mischievous goblins of Germanic folklore, and Mr. Mime is human enough that it could represent the changelings that fairies sometimes swap for human infants so they could be raised as humans. But the question remains, why are they weak to steel? According to most European folklore, iron, rather than steel, is an important element for repelling or harming fairies, ghosts, witches, and other supernatural beings. Various mythologies refer to cold iron, which modern media has portrayed as iron which was forged without fire. In reality, cold iron just refers to the fact that iron feels cool at room temperature, and was often used as a catch-all term for weapons made of iron, as seen in Rudyard Kipling's 1910 poem, Cold Iron. Gold is for the mistress, silver for the maid, copper for the craftsman cunning at his trade. Good, said the baron, sitting in his hall, but iron, cold iron, is master of them all. One of the most common arguments for why iron affects the fae in such a pronounced way is that fairies represent nature, while steel is a symbol of artifice, of humans conquering nature and bending it to their will. But there's some evidence to suggest that iron was seen as a material with magical properties of its own, and that the magic in iron could counteract the magic of the fairies. Lightning rods, for example, were frequently made of iron and installed in churches in Europe. Lightning would be drawn to these lightning rods and down into the earth instead of striking the church tower and bell. Lightning was mysterious and magical, associated with pagan gods like Thor and Zeus, and the ability to ward their churches from it allowed some members of the clergy to convince their parishioners that they could control the elements through the will of God. Others, though, recognized pagan mythology surrounding iron and argued that using it to direct lightning was akin to endorsing witchcraft. They point out that buildings with lightning rods were more frequently struck by lightning, a sure sign of God's wrath. The earliest mention of iron as a way to repel evil spirits dates back to Pliny's Natural History, where Pliny the Elder recommended recovering iron nails from tombs and driving them into the lintel over your front door in order to prevent the entrance of nocturnal spirits. He also attributed several other qualities to iron, including curing epilepsy, which was sometimes believed to be the result of witchcraft. The power of iron to protect against the supernatural isn't limited to minor spirits either. The story of St. Dunstan and the Devil describes the blacksmith tricking Satan himself and nailing a horseshoe to his hoof, refusing to remove it until the devil promised never to enter a home where a horseshoe was hung over the door. This tradition, over time, evolved into the modern superstition that horseshoes are lucky charms. There are even a few instances that suggest God himself is unable to overcome the power of iron. In the book of Judges, for example, we find this excerpt. And the Lord was with Judah, and he drove out the inhabitants of the mountain, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had chariots of iron. Despite God toppling the stone walls of Jericho, This verse makes it seem that he was unable to assist the Israelites in battle against an enemy armed with iron technology, although this seems to be corrected a few chapters later. The book of Deuteronomy also prohibits the use of iron tools from being used to build altars, but it's unclear if this was because the use of iron impaired God's power, or if it was a common taboo against iron tools at sacred sites among Mesopotamian religions. With all of these facts on the table, the best explanation is that ancient civilizations believed iron to be a magical material, but, more importantly, it was the magic specific to humans. It could harness lightning, guide your ship, and cut through softer materials like wood and bronze, which were used by more superstitious peoples who saw iron as defeating the protections bestowed upon them by their gods and ancestors. And while fairies are often seen as treading the line between this life and the next, iron, which smells like blood, was seen as a tool to both create and protect life, the antithesis of fairies, the light to their darkness. So fairies being weak to steel isn't a new phenomenon. The power of iron over the supernatural has been documented for as long as 3,000 years, evolving into a variety of myths and legends that we still recognize today. And the fairy-type weakness to steel is just a modern reinterpretation of one of our oldest myths. But if I missed any important details, or if you have another theory, tell me about it in the comments. Alright, that's all I've got for you today. I know this one's a little bit different since it doesn't focus on the Alola region specifically, and it goes a little bit more into the mythological inspirations for Pokemon, but I hope that you learned something new regardless. As always, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss future updates, and that like button, it really helps me out. Alright, until next time, Alola.